Welcome back. In an earlier lecture, I talked a little bit about English incursions into Wales in the 11th century. In this lecture, I want to tell the story of Wales from the 11th century down to about the 15th century. I'll talk about the tangled politics within Wales itself and about the complicated relationship between Wales and England that culminated in the conquest of Wales. Finally, I'll say something about the fascinating literature of medieval Wales. Let's start with some basic facts about Welsh society. Wales, like Ireland, was very culturally unified, but it was politically divided, partly due to its geography. The terrain is quite mountainous, and although the mountains are not all that high, the topography is challenging enough to make it easy for authority to be fragmented into small units, perhaps as small in some cases as a single valley. Nevertheless, there were several large centers of power, or what we might call petty kingdoms. But the ability of these kings or lords to control their followers was very tenuous, and persistent succession struggles continually worked against the creation of political stability. The political center of gravity could shift according to the personal abilities of each successive ruler. Throughout the Middle Ages, Wales was divided along geographic lines roughly into thirds. In the south, there were a series of small kingdoms, ranging from Dyfed in the southwest to Gwent in the southeast. In central Wales, the dominant power was the kingdom of Powys. The most important lordship, however, was Gwynedd in the northwest, where several generations of rulers were able to exert a loose overlordship over many of the other Welsh princes. It was Gwynedd that would produce the closest thing we ever see to a native ruler over all of Wales. Of course, the most important geographic fact in Welsh history has been the relationship with its larger and richer neighbor to the east. The history of relations between England and Wales is long and complicated. It goes back to the period of the Germanic settlements, when the area of Celtic speech slowly receded westward across the country. As I said in my lecture about Britain after the fall of Rome, a more or less stable situation developed whereby Celtic-speaking rulers were confined to the area we now know as Wales, but there was still considerable cross-border raiding between Wales and the various English kingdoms. It was to defend against such raids that King Offa of the English kingdom of Mercia built his famous dike in the 8th century, large sections of which can still be seen today. In the subsequent few centuries, there was the occasional serious incident when Welsh rulers would cause trouble on the English side of the border, or vice versa, but these raids were usually rather ephemeral. The dynamic changed considerably with the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Under the early Norman kings, English settlers made inroads in Wales, intending not just to seize plunder or teach the natives a lesson, but rather to settle permanently. The Normans had some lasting successes, especially in the south, where they created a colony in what is now Pembrokeshire that ultimately provided some of the most prominent members of the contingent that embarked on the conquest of Ireland in the 12th century. But the Normans had never really conquered the whole place, and in fact, some of their early gains in North Wales in the late 11th century were wiped out when the powerful ruler of Gwynedd, Griffith ap Cynon, defeated and killed the Norman lord Robert of Rhuddlan. The Welsh also drove out the Norman-imposed Bishop of Bangor, Hervey le Breton, who was forced to beg King Henry I of England for another job. He ended up as bishop of the new See of Ely, all the way in eastern England, as far away from Wales as he could get. Wales proved a tougher nut to crack than England had, in part because political authority was so divided. Whereas in 1066 the Normans had been able to make significant gains just by defeating King Harold of England, in Wales, the ruler of Powys did not feel bound to follow the lead of the ruler of Gwynedd, or vice versa. Of course, whenever the political situation in England was difficult, the Welsh tended to take advantage. But the division within Wales cut both ways. Since the Welsh fought with each other as much as they did with the English, they had great difficulty in unifying sufficiently to see off the English threat for good. Periodically, though, as I mentioned, Wales did produce leaders who made a run at establishing hegemony over the whole country. The most important came from Gwynedd, and I'll just talk about two of them. I'm afraid they are both named Llywelyn. The first is named Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, which means Llywelyn, son of Iorwerth. A quick word about Welsh naming practices. The word ap in Llywelyn ap Iorwerth comes from map, which means son, and through one of those initial mutations that the Celtic languages are famous for, the M disappears and we're just left with ap. Incidentally, this is one of the places where you can see the difference between P Celtic and Q Celtic languages the most clearly. The word map is the exact equivalent of the Irish word mac, as you find in countless Irish and Scottish surnames. But back to Llywelyn ap Iorwerth. He was also known as Llywelyn Fawr, or Llywelyn the Great. How did he get that nickname? By extending his overlordship over much of Wales, and by dealing with the English on virtually an equal footing. Llywelyn's story is a good one because it brings up a theme that recurs in Welsh history. We have in Wales the phenomenon that was characteristic of all the Celtic-speaking regions, the lack of clear rules for the succession. As we saw in the lecture on medieval Scotland, one of the ways in which the Scots achieved a fairly stable political system was by adopting English-style primogeniture. That didn't happen in Wales. Llywelyn was the grandson of a previous king of Gwynedd, but he had to fight two of his uncles and then a cousin to establish himself as ruler, and he was never entirely safe from challenges by members of his own family. Still, Llywelyn must have been a man of great charisma and personal authority, because he did manage to assert his hegemony over most of the native rulers in Wales. Though this hegemony was fairly loose, nothing like the English king's power over his vassals and officials. One of the clearest signs of Llywelyn's authority was the fact that he made a peace treaty with King John of England in 1200, and he even married John's illegitimate daughter, Joan. This brings me to an interesting aspect of Welsh society that also parallels what we see in Ireland, namely the fact that the rules of marriage were a little different from those in England. In Wales and Ireland, the marital status of the parents was less important in determining whether a child had inheritance rights. The key question was whether the father acknowledged paternity. The church was attempting to change this, and in fact, Llywelyn himself had gotten the church to back him in his struggle against his uncles by claiming that the uncles were illegitimate. But it was still true that legitimacy or illegitimacy wasn't really seen as that big a deal, and thus it was a pretty major coup for Llywelyn to marry even the illegitimate daughter of the English king. Llywelyn, though, was trying to change the rules and insist on legitimate status for heirs in Wales. In fact, he was trying to normalize the inheritance system so that it looked more like the English system, very much along the lines of what the Scottish kings had been doing since the late 11th century. The idea in both Wales and Scotland was to try to make the rules clearer, and also to conform to the customs of the Anglo-Norman world so that it was easier to get along with their neighbors. In a certain sense, Llywelyn was trying to at least partly assimilate Wales to English norms. The relationship between Llywelyn and King John of England did not work out well, however, and here we see another important theme in Welsh history come into play: disunity among the Welsh rulers. Llywelyn seems to have allied himself with the English noble family of de Brieux, which held lands along the Welsh border. But then the de Brieuses fell out with King John, and Llywelyn was drawn into the dispute. King John's supporter, the Earl of Chester, then attacked Gwynedd. In 1211, King John invaded Gwynedd personally, and here's the kicker: John was supported by most of the other princes of Wales, who were trying to ally with John in order to put Llywelyn in his place and preserve their own autonomy. John was able to seize a number of hostages from Llywelyn. These hostages were adolescent sons of Llywelyn's major supporters, and John planned to hold them to guarantee that Llywelyn would keep the peace. But the Welsh ruler nevertheless defied John, so the following year, in 1212, John planned a second invasion, and he had even begun executing the hostages when, we learn from one account, a message arrived from John's daughter Joan, Llywelyn's wife, warning him that if he invaded Wales again, his own nobles, the English nobles, would rise up and overthrow him. I mentioned briefly that John had fallen out with his vassals, the de Brieux family. Well, the de Brieuxes were not John's only domestic enemies, and in this case, John's difficulty was Llywelyn's opportunity. John was quickly hurtling towards the confrontation with his barons that would culminate in him being forced to accept Magna Carta in 1215, and Llywelyn allied himself with these rebellious barons. He captured the English border town of Shrewsbury in support of the rebels' efforts to force John into a settlement. So John's Welsh invasion was abandoned, and a few years later, the text of the Great Charter would specifically call on John to release the remaining Welsh hostages, including one of Llywelyn's illegitimate sons. Llywelyn went on to rule Gwynedd and to dominate Wales until his death in 1240. He certainly earned his nickname of Llywelyn the Great. The second Llywelyn I want to talk about is his grandson, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd. He was in fact the son of Llywelyn the Great's illegitimate son, Gruffydd, the hostage who was released under the terms of Magna Carta. Llywelyn the Great had passed over Gruffydd in the succession in favor of his legitimate son, Dafydd, whose mother was Princess Joan. And almost inevitably, after the death of their father, the two half-brothers fought each other for the rulership of Gwynedd. The English king, Henry III, used this internecine dispute in Wales to his advantage to keep the Welsh at each other's throats, and it was in a sense only a happy accident that by 1246, Gruffydd's son Llywelyn was the last man standing. I'm somewhat giving away the ending, though, when I tell you that his nickname is Llywelyn ein Llw Olaf, which translates roughly as Llywelyn the Last, as in the last Prince of Wales. Some of the same themes we saw during the reign of the first Llywelyn also characterize the reign of his grandson. One of these is the fact that Wales always did well when England was in political turmoil. King Henry III of England faced a major baronial revolt in the 1250s and 60s, and Llywelyn allied with the king's main opponent, Simon de Montfort, though Simon was ultimately killed in battle in 1265. And we see a repeat of the fluctuating alliances between the English king and the other rulers of Wales, who were not always thrilled about one of their number being first among equals. So how did Llywelyn ap Gruffydd become Llywelyn the Last? The final conquest of Wales came about when Llywelyn clashed with the son and successor of King Henry III, Edward I, over the feudal homage that Llywelyn supposedly owed to the English king under the terms of the Treaty of Montgomery, signed in 1267. Relations between Edward and Llywelyn were not improved when Llywelyn married Simon de Montfort's daughter, Eleanor, who, by the way, was Edward's first cousin, since Simon de Montfort was married to King Henry's sister. It is hard to exaggerate how closely intertwined all of these people were with each other. King Edward saw this marriage as a power move by the Welsh ruler and tried to prevent it from taking place. Throughout the 1270s, there were repeated clashes between Edward and Llywelyn. The English king made use of Llywelyn's resentful and treacherous younger brother, Dafydd, who had actually plotted to assassinate Llywelyn as a means of fomenting discontent in Gwynedd. Dafydd was quite willing to go along with Edward's plan to conquer much of Wales and set Dafydd up as ruler of a small remaining territory. By 1277, Llywelyn had been forced to concede large tracts of Welsh land to English rule. The end came in 1282, and it was precipitated by Dafydd. Many of the Welsh lords who were now effectively under English lordship due to Edward's previous conquests thought better of their support for English rule once it became clear that Edward would be a harsh overlord, and Dafydd himself precipitated a rebellion against the English. Llywelyn felt obliged to support his brother, God knows why, and he was forced into a war that he was ill-prepared to fight. In December 1282, Llywelyn was killed in battle, and his head was displayed in London for the next 15 years. After Llywelyn's death, King Edward made it his business to conquer all of Wales once and for all, and he made sure of his conquest by building a series of impressive castles, many of which still stand today. If you look at the way the castles are distributed on a map, it is quite clear that they were planned to place a kind of cordon around Gwynedd. But you also see some of them extending down the westward coast of Wales. They range today from very ruined to quite well preserved. For example, Aberystwyth Castle is pretty ruinous now, as is Flint Castle, but at the other end of the spectrum is Rhuddlan Castle, which is pretty intact. Finally, I want to mention Carnarvon Castle, where Edward I's son, Edward, was born in 1284. He later became Edward II. This young prince became the first heir to the English throne to be named Prince of Wales, a tradition that continues to this day. There's a later story that after the conquest of Wales, Edward I promised the Welsh that he would give them a prince born in Wales who spoke no English. It was, of course, a trick, because he really meant his infant son, Edward, who at the time spoke no language of any kind. Incidentally, when the current holder of the title, Prince Charles, was preparing to be inaugurated as Prince of Wales, he took a crash course in Welsh. I have no idea how much Welsh he remembers today. The story of King Edward's trick on the Welsh is probably apocryphal, but it does say something about relations between the Welsh and the English. It was a pretty thorough, brutal conquest. Of all of England's attempts to subdue the lands of the Celtic fringe, the efforts against Wales had the most success. Those castles did the trick. Wales still retains a separate cultural identity, but the political integration with England has been quite complete. I'd like to make a quick digression here into modern British politics. The question of the status of the Prince of Wales in the modern period is quite interesting because of the recent changes made to the long-standing British rules of succession that traditionally preferred male children to female children in the royal line. It used to be the case that all the sons of a monarch came first in the line of succession before any of the daughters, even if the daughters were older. For example, the oldest child of Queen Victoria was Princess Victoria, but the heir to the throne was her younger brother, Albert Edward, who became Prince of Wales and later succeeded to the throne as Edward VII. 4 decades later, King George VI had 2 daughters and no sons, so the question of preferring a younger brother to an older sister did not arise. Then both Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Charles produced male children first, so again there was no question. In the meantime, of course, the views of society about relations between the genders had undergone a dramatic shift, and it no longer seemed natural for males to be preferred to females. When Prince Charles's first son, Prince William, married Catherine Middleton in 2011, the British Parliament faced an impending situation. What if the first child of the royal couple was a girl followed by a boy? Would the British public stand for it if the younger boy displaced the older girl? It was decided that something needed to be done, and a new law was passed to change the rules and get rid of the gender preference altogether. Parliament took the same opportunity to get rid of the rule that the heir to the throne cannot marry a Catholic, which was left over from a period when England was afraid of domination by Catholic countries on the continent of Europe. The reason all of this is interesting from a Welsh perspective is that while there have been plenty of princesses of Wales who were the wives of princes of Wales, there has technically never been a Princess of Wales in her own right. When Queen Elizabeth was the heir, it was briefly proposed that she be named Princess of Wales, but this never went anywhere. Supposedly, Elizabeth herself was not keen on the idea. But in the future, provided the monarchy continues, there may very well be a Princess of Wales rather than a Prince of Wales. So what happened after the conquests of Edward I in Wales? The country was suppressed remarkably quickly. There were a few uprisings, but nothing major until the revolt of Owain Glyndŵr in 1400, made famous in Shakespeare's play Henry IV, Part 1. Here the figure of Owain is seen as rather flighty and unreliable, obsessed with magic and prophecy. Though in fact, the real Owain was a substantial figure. He was descended from the native princes of Powys in central Wales, and he entered into a major conspiracy with two English rebel lords, with the idea that the three men would divide the island of Britain three ways. Owain's two English confederates were defeated at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, but Owain managed to hang on against the English until 1409, when he was forced into hiding. He was last spotted in 1412, and there is a report of his death in 1416, but since it is not known where he died or where his body is, a legend grew up that, like King Arthur, Owain would come again to restore the fortunes of the Welsh people. I mentioned that Shakespeare does not treat Owain very kindly, but Shakespeare didn't look down on all the Welsh. One of his most interesting minor characters, in my opinion, is the Welsh Captain Llewellyn from the play Henry V. It's a play filled with scoundrels and characters who are ambivalent at best, but Llewellyn is one of the only truly honorable men in the play. And Henry himself claims Welsh identity in the play. "For I am Welsh, you know." And this is due to his birth at Monmouth in Wales. It's interesting to note that while the English have entertained some rather vicious stereotypes about the Irish and about the Highland Scots, they've never been quite as negatively disposed towards the Welsh. I think one reason for this is that the Welsh were conquered comparatively early in the history of England. Any fears the English may have had about the Welsh were laid to rest long ago. Still, Wales remained undeveloped in comparison to England, and it seemed to the English like the back of beyond. And this remoteness led to the rise of an expression that sounds like it is an ethnic slur against the Welsh, but it really isn't. Back in the 18th century, when debtors' prisons still existed, people who were afraid of being arrested for debt sometimes fled to Wales, where it was harder to track people down. Some of the people who did this were actually bookmakers who could not pay off their bets. They would flee to Wales, and this was called welshing on a bet. Nowadays, this refers generally to people who refuse or fail to pay their debts of honor. So it's not actually an insult against Welsh people's honesty, but it is a reminder that Wales was seen as a place to go to when you needed to disappear. Let's return for the remainder of this lecture to Welsh literature produced during the Middle Ages. The corpus of medieval Welsh literature is not as extensive as the Irish one, but it has arguably been far more influential on European literature as a whole. One remarkable thing to note about this literature is that much of what we have is preserved in only two manuscripts. The White Book of Rhydderch, so called because it is bound in white leather, which was written in southwest Wales in about 1350, and the Red Book of Hergest, this one bound in red leather, which was written after 1382 along the border with England. And incidentally, J.R.R. Tolkien named his fictional manuscript that supposedly contained the Lord of the Rings stories the Red Book of Westmarch, after the Red Book of Hergest. So what is this corpus of Welsh literature? The oldest literary texts we have are poems from the early Middle Ages. They include some beautiful laments for the loss of love and youth, as well as the epic poem The Gododin, which I talked about in several earlier lectures as part of the literary legacy of the Old North, the regions of northern Britain that had once been Celtic-speaking. Much of what was produced from the 11th century onwards consists of praise poetry for the Welsh princes. Just as we see in Ireland and Scotland, Welsh princes commissioned poetry and historical texts to boost their standing among their subjects and fellow rulers. And by the way, it's not unheard of for rulers in non-Celtic-speaking areas to commission flattering literary works. It's just that in the Celtic regions, this is taken to an extreme, and even relatively minor lords did it. Some of this flattery was really kind of absurd. You might have long poems praising a guy who, at the most, controlled one valley. But this is a poor society that largely operates on face-to-face contacts and word of mouth, and praise is one of the major lubricants of the system. The most influential works of Welsh medieval literature, though, are the 4 anonymous prose tales known collectively as the Mabinogi, commonly but not technically correctly referred to as the Mabinogion, as well as the tales that relate to King Arthur, which I talk about in another lecture. These tales became popular in France and then throughout Europe, and they still influence popular culture to this day. The Mabinogi is a puzzling work if you just come to it cold. The 4 tales are often referred to as the 4 branches, but if you read them, you're not exactly sure what they are branches of. They're interrelated. There are some characters that occur in more than one of the stories, but the relationship between them doesn't seem especially close. I'll just run through some quick plot summaries of the first 2 branches to give you a sense of what we're talking about. In the first branch, which is called Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed, the title character, Pwyll, does a service for the lord of the underworld, Arawn, and is rewarded with a mysterious supernatural bride named Rhiannon, who rides a horse that can never be caught up with, even when it seems to be merely walking. Rhiannon and Pwyll have many adventures before they can finally marry, but Rhiannon eventually bears a son, Pryderi. The core of the story is the disappearance of the infant Pryderi, for which Rhiannon is initially blamed, but Pryderi is eventually restored to his rightful place and succeeds Pwyll in ruling Dyfed. In the second branch, which is called Branwen, daughter of Llyr, we have completely new characters. Branwen is the sister of Bran the Blessed, King of Britain. The King of Ireland, Matholwch, asks for her hand in marriage, which Bran grants. But because Branwen's half-brother, Efnisien, is not consulted on the matter, Efnisien angrily mutilates the horses of the Irish delegation, and a lasting resentment is created. Once Branwen is back in Ireland, she produces a son, Gwern, but she is badly treated at the Irish court, and the king forces her to work in the kitchens. She trains a starling to bring word of her predicament back to King Bran, who invades Ireland on her behalf. I should mention here that Bran is a giant. He is so large that he can wade across the Irish Sea. Once he arrives, Branwen makes peace between her husband and her brother, but war breaks out again due to Efnisien, who seizes his nephew Gwern and throws him on the fire. The 2 sides proceed to slaughter each other, though the action is prolonged by the fact that the Irish possess a magic cauldron that can bring the dead back to life. Bran is finally killed as well, and his head is cut off, though it continues to talk, and the head is then buried in London at the site of the later Tower of London, where it will supposedly ward off invasion. And this story may or may not be connected to the tradition that England will be safe as long as ravens live at the Tower. The name Bran means crow in Welsh, and ravens are closely related to crows. Branwen also returns to Britain, only to die of grief. I won't describe the other 2 branches in detail, but they contain the same marvelous mixture of supernatural elements and human drama. Scholars have several different theories about what the Mabinogi is supposed to be about. Many scholars have claimed that these stories preserve original Celtic mythology. Characters such as Arawn and Rhiannon certainly seem to represent gods of some kind. One of the most interesting theories argues that the first branch of the Mabinogi preserves a memory of the raid of the Celts on Delphi in 270 BC. This is almost certainly not the case. As we have seen, it is highly unlikely that the people living in Wales in the Middle Ages had any particular connection to the Galatai who attacked Delphi in the 3rd century BC. This theory is a remnant of the old Celtic hypothesis that saw one overarching Celtic civilization preserving its tales throughout the Celtic areas down through the centuries. More recently, scholars have suggested that whatever the origins of these tales might be, and surely they do have their roots in ancient mythology in some fashion, Their current form reflects a sophisticated literary sensibility. The style of the prose is highly polished and very pleasing, and there are subtle touches that weave the four tales together, even though it can be hard to see the connections at first blush, since they don't all contain the same characters. Not everybody loves the Mabinogi, but I do, and I highly recommend giving it a try. Finally, I want to mention a Welsh literary figure who lived a little bit later than the authors of the Mabinogi, during the period after the English conquest, the great poet Dafydd ap Gwilym. Dafydd lived in the middle of the 14th century, though we're unsure of the exact dates. He wrote with great wit and verve about both love and nature, and here are excerpts from just two of my favorites. The first is from The Girls of Llanbadarn.
I am bent with wrath, a plague upon all the women of this parish, for I've never had a single one.
The second is from a poem whose title I won't give away, but it might help to explain the poet's difficulties with women.
I always deemed my features bright and beautiful and fair, until yon mirror met my sight, when lo, an ugly face was there. Thou blue round moon, thou drear delusion, thou magnet-fashioned sorceress, thou world of dreams and dire confusion, ice-like in hue and brittleness. Let hell consume the hateful, thin, bent-lipped mirror.
These poems truly are wonderful. We really feel we get to know the poet and his personal frustrations and delights. Despite the political difficulties the Welsh experienced, they were able to take refuge in a remarkable literary tradition that laid the foundations for what is arguably the strongest surviving Celtic language today.